Hello and welcome to the Miko Bits show, and I'm your host, Miko Bits. Today, I have Ryan from Delphi Digital, and we're here to talk about basically in-game economics and play to earn. As you all probably know, that most of the hardcore gamer segment have basically taken a bit of a cold shoulder to this new entrant in the gaming sphere. So, we're seeing the rise of play to earn, but we're also seeing a little bit of hard reception. So, one of the really interesting topics we'll get into is sort of, really kind of trying to help everyone reason about the economics and sustainability of play to earn gaming. So, with that in mind, here's Ryan. Ryan, welcome to the Miko Bits show.
Hi, yeah. Thank you for having me, Miko, and really excited to kind of jam here and speak about, I think one, play to earn, play and earn, the sustainability of such systems, and also I think alluding to your earlier point, talking about how these AAA game studios are sort of coming in and kind of the challenges they might face, and how they might begin to navigate these challenges in developing some awesome play to earn and play and earn games, right? So I think you know maybe what's best to sort of set the context here would be kind of speaking a bit more about play to earn and play and earn and the definitions behind them, right? So I think with play to earn and play and earn, just as a group, I would say the most interesting thing about them from a game designer's perspective or a game economy designer's perspective or developer's perspective is that now you can kind of build a game with a different kind of monetization model from the previous ones in the past. So if you think on the history of game monetization models, way back we had, coin operated arcade machines in 1971 and you could like put in 50 cents or like a quarter and then you get like a bunch of gameplay, right? And then that led to a certain type of game being built, like really skill-based games, and you end up with you're like losing if you're not that good, but it's also like spectatorial and it's like a high score and it's a competitive element. So those are kind of games that are being built. And then you like, go to premium games or like box games, right? And these games would be a 50 or 60 US dollars and they would ship them out to your home, or you stop by GameStop and pick them on the way home and ask mom like, hey, can I get the game please? That's one
Yeah.
type of game, and it led to this like big budget like pre-production, production, and then QA process type of games, right? And then that's kind of a lot of the core game industry, AAA game industry that's operating right now. Companies like Activision, Blizzard, companies like Ubisoft as well, right? Then you have this sort of paradigm shift again with like free to play, and of course you have monetization that you have this sort of metric or data driven type of game development, right? Where it's kind of focusing on finding the fun, but that fun is found through data, right? So it's, well, if players are kind of staying around after the first day, that's called day one retention. If players are staying around after the seventh day, that's day seven. And what's the cost of impressing them, so to speak? So CPI, right? And then if all the numbers check out, then we fund the game and build that game. And that's kind of hyper casual, right? And that's really extreme of free to play, leaning towards ad monetization. So you kind of show ads in order for the business model to work, right? And then you have like on the other end microtransaction monetization where they're kind of selling in-app purchases and progression and cosmetics and the like. So you have this kind of across the board, but that's kind of the spectrum of monetization in free to play. So I think what like play to earn and play and earn really offer is a kind of a break from all these kind of previous monetization models, and with that I think a new kind of game can get developed, like kind of vision based games, right? So games that are where players in the community can kind of rally around a vision and buy into that vision, and then you have this kind of user acquisition engine powered by play to earn and tokens. I think that's like a really fascinating kind of paradigm shift for games, because now anyone can kind of spin up a game even if they don't have that sort of traditional experience, and that's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because you're going to end up with a lot of projects that people who are not necessarily qualified might go up and start it anyway, right? So it might be more marketing than the game development itself. But the latter half, you get kind of these games that will never have gotten like sort of traditional funding just because like they don't have experience with metrics and all these different parts of building free-to-play games, and now they, can be funded by people who love the vision. So I think the analog here is like Stardew Valley would never have been built if, they were pitching a free-to-play game studio, a free-to-play
So
publisher. So yeah.
so one thing I think has been really amazing is this kind of extremely toxic reaction from hardcore gaming, right? So if you look at the Ghost Recon NFT launch of Ubisoft, I think they sold 15 NFTs, and the kind of the thing that's more interesting is the kind of qualitative, right? Which is if you read what people are saying, like there's just total vitriol, right? So my hot take is this. My hot take is that gaming has always been business versus art, right? And in a sense, like the thing that's happened is when you look at like Ready Player One, right? The evil guy is the money guy, right? Like he's evil, right? And the good guys are like the art guys, right? So it's sort of like art good, money, business bad, right? So in a sense, like in the history of gaming, any whiff of money is basically tied to some evil controller who's here to like ruin everything because he's greedy, right? Like that's generally he, right? It's usually a he, right? So like, so these overlords are kind of like here to ruin everything with money, right? So that I think that's my hot take. But like, what's your thoughts around like this extremely negative reception? Because I think that was some people are pretty surprised. I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think on 2 points here, but I would like to touch on the Ready Player One, like business versus art point. And yeah, I think in metaverses I cover like level 4, I cover about funding of games, and I talk about Free Guy, right? So Free Guy is the latest kind of gamer-centered movie, like 2021, and there is kind of this core conflict of like data driven games that are being built, and this is one guy who's like an evil controller who's like, I don't care, man, I'm gonna release the sequel, whatever, delete all the old characters. And then there's the
I
other one
love
who's very
this.
much like, I'm gonna build this like natural world, it's like it's not free city, it's gonna be like life itself or something like that, right? And I
Yeah.
think I get this sense that like this sort of monetary incentive, you kind of get this like squeeze of the players in a sense. And I think that kind of is the natural progression from this idea of obsession around metrics, like LTV of player versus like customer acquisition costs. So I think when we kind of begin to frame the ways in which the relationship in which gamers have with developers as that equation, I think like that itself becomes like a really driving force. And I think one way to understand it sort of to even go back to step back a bit from this is like to think about the business of games, right? So, I don't think business and making games is necessarily bad because you kind of have to fund the games, right? So I think two things
Yeah.
with regards to sustainability. One is you have to fund the games in their initial development, right? Or at least initial kind of start so that, start founders can go out or companies can go out and actually start those projects so we can play those games because we just want to play the games, right? And the
Yeah.
second is to sustain the development of the game in proportion with its user base growing, right? And so how do you kind of sustain the development of the game, right? And that ties back on to the monetization models that we kind of employ, right? So if a company doesn't have enough revenue to continue developing the game, then they just necessarily have to shut down the game and the operations of the game because it wouldn't make sense for them to continue doing updates, live services, right? In sort of our tradition, in our current sort of game environment. And yeah, like and the biggest example here is like Club Penguin, which had over 200 million users after being acquired by Disney, right? Which is
Yeah.
one of the biggest entertainment companies all time. But they had to shut down operations just because they couldn't justify the server spend and the developer spend. So they had to shut down in I think 2017. So I need to fact check that one, but the idea is that sustainability of the games is just as important as funding it, just as important as the player base. And I think it's win-win-win if like the game can continue to run, right? And you can kind of develop monetization models where it's naturally running accordingly. So I think just touching upon that point. Um, as for like the triple A, the toxic reaction from like these hardcore gaming,
Yeah.
I think you kind of like split it into the developers themselves, right? as well as like the players, right? The player base. So I think, if you kind of analyze like the reaction from developers, there's kind of initial hesitancy, right? But then again, like the way they, I think, you know, to have them try to understand, it always comes back again to the lens of like, well, how is this gonna serve my, you know, quarterly report? How is this gonna serve my LTV,
Yeah,
CAC
yeah, yeah.
ratio? And I think with kind of play to earn and play and earn, it is, there's not much historical data to go off beyond sort of the breakout of Axie, right? So, but I will say that like if you sort of spend more time like diving into it and really like sort of try to figure out different business models that operate on similar principles of like giving control to the player in certain regards, right? Like sort of allowing upside to be shared with different the player base, and I think it is a whole allowing like sort of community buy-in. It is and influence of development. I think it's like a whole suite of things, right? And I think the challenge with some of these initial experiments is that um, one is difficult, and this is on the developer side. One is difficult to get such projects greenlit, at least in its entirety, right? It's because of institutional inertia, and you having to get consensus across many different nodes. I think even the blockchain folks like kind of understand this one. So I think that in itself is going to be a big challenge for these games because now they can't lean in fully into the promise of play and earn blockchain, right? And they kind of have to have this hybridized approach where it's like, well, I'm selling you the game, but I'm also selling you the NFTs. But NFTs
So
don't do much in the game, and you can kind of trade them, but that's about it. And that
yeah, yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
and the and from the part of the gamers, then there's this kind of reaction where it's like, well, these NFTs are not actually doing anything in the game, like not very much anyway. It doesn't change my gameplay qualitatively, right? So, you know, isn't this just the way for you to experiment extracting more value and LTV so-called from me, right? So I think that's the kind of like relationship that's kind of unfolded with some of the more controversial NFT launches, and of course like small more issues such as like environmental destruction and such, like these kind of questions come up, I think, related to blockchain and crypto. And yeah, it's not necessarily always correct, but I think like just the common consensus around some folks in the community, like in the gamer community, that seems to be like what a lot of gamers have like rested to and defaulted to as an argument against crypto, which we can kind of sit here and talk about like proof of stake and talk about like proof of history and all these kind of other different ways that trees aren't being burnt, but I think that ship has sailed, so to speak. And my thought is that one is education, one approach is education, and the second approach is like knowing that a different user base will come around, right, for these kind of games. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I just to kind of like put a pin in it, I think all I have to say on kind of Ethereum electricity consumption is that it'll drop by at least 99.3% when we hit the merge, right? So I think proof of stake is going to help, right? So, but I don't want to deep dive there. I definitely legitimize concern for the planet, but I think it has to be founded in like reality. And if Ethereum succeeds, then it should be not a problem. So, but what I wanted to get to though is sustainability, right? Because when you look at Axie, they're incentivizing their player base, which is lovely, right? But like, what's the economic input, right? And do the players themselves create economic value other than these kind of mild network effects of having other people to play against, or these kind of very lightweight things, right? Because in a sense, like when we look at like a sustainable economy, it can't really take the form of a giveaway. It has to kind of, and it in a way, like ideally it doesn't like require constant adding of new players, that are buying game pieces, right? That's that, so that feels more like a Ponzi-nomic. So how do you see, what are the factors that could increase the sustainability, other than just kind of perpetually selling more and more NFTs?
That's a good question. So I think when we talk about sustainability, we can default to the frame of like, games as products, right? So when we think of games as products, we begin to think, okay, there's this sort of search and iteration towards product market fit, right? And once there's product market fit, it means there's kind of a willing buyer for whatever a seller might, want to sell, right? And in this case, in play to earn and in Axie, the seller is not the game developer per se. You kind of end up the game developer ends up being kind of an economy designer, right? Providing ways for players to earn within the game, to generate new resources within the game, but they don't take an active hand in selling those resources to other players, quite unlike like free to play games, for example, or like microtransaction model, right? And that itself is really interesting. However, the problem doesn't go away, where you still have to kind of build something that players want, right? Or players are willing to spend on. It's just as of current, players, the sort of tendency towards for player behavior is to sort of tend towards breeding these axes in order to sell to new players, right? Or sell to new entrants, right?
Totally.
And that can change, right? And I think one, of course, the thing to focus on here is like for the consumers or the players who pay for these outputs that are generated by the sellers, so to speak, or the grinders, so to speak, right? they
You-
You have to kind of make it even more attractive value proposition for them. So I think one kind of way to sort of make Axie a bit more sustainable is to have a progression-based elder game, right? So
Yeah.
how do you kind of have a different game from the one we currently have? And we do have an elder game in Axie. It's called breeding, right? So this is kind of breeding mini game. This is some management sim, right? That you kind of engage in. But like, I think you have to kind of go beyond that as well and allow, like, for example, competitive elements like esports to come into the picture, right? You have to kind of introduce new sinks and consumable based economy, right? Where, like, these grinders can now create consumables for like these how do you say, whales, I suppose, to
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
begin spending.
you're talking about like a resource gathering. So you're talking about things like gold mining, wow gold mining, right? You're talking about things like power leveling, right? So these are kind of tried and true
Yeah,
in the WoW
precisely.
ecosystem.
Yeah, precisely. Like, farming gold, like power leveling characters. I think power leveling characters is a really interesting one in WoW, for example. But like the one I find like the most wholesome. So I like to think of WoW as like play to earn, right? It's just like, there's the if you're a gold farmer, it's play to earn, right? Because now you're
Yep.
just like showing up and you're like kind of collecting as much gold as possible, and other players are like, whoa, like come on, man, like you're kind of like stealing all my, I don't know, frost. I can't remember the name of the herbs now, right? But the idea, that's the idea, right? And then with like play and earn, I think Diablo 2's economy, interestingly enough, is very very much a play and earn economy, because we're talking about power leveling and sort of farming items. You actually end up with very, I think at least in Diablo 2 Resurrected, which I'm super excited to play, like
Yeah.
the new ladder for, but you end up with players who are kind of organically providing services for each other, and this is kind of like constructed by the game economy designers, right? Where it's like, well, I need a smiter, a paladin who's trained in smite, and has smite gear to defeat my Ubers so I can get like this, rare torch that buffs my character, right? I need magic finders within the game to find all the shakos and the runes so that I can buy them and create my PvP character, right? Which is another elder game. I need
Yep.
people to farm like the charms and all that so I can pay them for it. And there's like there's cash rich players and there's sort of time poor players. And the time poor players are happy to kind of engage in that how do you call it, exchange. So even power leveling, they call it G rushing. So you're rushing players is a service, right? And the interesting thing about Diablo 2 is like, unlike a lot of the other games out there with kind of in-game economy, it does have exposure, at least to a limited degree, to kind of real-world economic value, right? So examples of some sites that like sites that some players engage with, which represents some of exposure to the open economy, be like D2JSP, right? So on D2JSP, there's a currency called Forum Gold, which you can kind of buy into, right, with real world cash, and then you can kind of use that as a medium of trade, and it has been kind of the de facto medium of exchange for Diablo 2 players who want to kind of not do barter, right? Or not like trade using runes necessarily. So there's two economies. One is the rune economy, and then there's the kind of value for runes that's denominated in forum gold, right? and people pay for services and all of that using forum gold. And you can find that in forum gold, like some of the services can be go up to a few $100s just to get a rare armor. And this is a game that's like lasted 9 to 10 years, for example, right? So
Sure.
that's something that like is really interesting to kind of deep dive into and think like, well, what can we learn from a game like this that has like sort of stood the test of time and like kept players interested in coming back.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, right? The thing that I think is interesting though is that we're really talking about kind of nominal value accretion, and you're really talking about kind of the arbitrage of time value, right? So in a sense, like if you go back to kind of Chinese World of Warcraft gold, I used to call it Chinese because like when you look at IGN or you look at these old gold mining companies, a lot of them were based in China, basically based on this time arbitrage construct, right? But one of the things that I kind of wanted to poke here is, like, we're obviously both, invested in YGG. And one of the things that I think is super interesting when you look at the YGG proposition is that they're playing the economic metagame, like the post-Axie, right? Obviously, the management sim is part of the game, but like it goes far beyond that, right? So for me, one example, a question is like, how many people work at Delphi Digital?
Well, I've gotten a lot of
Keeps
emails
growing.
saying, welcome your new colleagues. So I think now there's about 80 perhaps across the three divisions of Delphi. Yeah,
Yeah,
research,
yeah.
labs, ventures.
Yeah, yeah. So there's about 80 people that work there, right? But like, what if you looked at YGG's 10,000 scholars? What if you looked at YGG as a hedge fund with 10,000 analysts, right? So, if you looked at it from that lens, right, then what's happened is that YGG has actually converted the playtime of their player base into an analytic resource for their investment. So, like, if you think about it from that lens, like, that's exponential value extraction as opposed to kind of this very nominal like this person's time playing World of Warcraft is like slightly less valuable than this other player, so I think if you look at it from that lens, like that's a really interesting kind of end game value proposition.
Wow, that's Delphi with 80, YGG with 10,000. Yeah, I'm just glad we're investors in YGG then.
Yeah,
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 but
yeah. Well, you guys were
I'm
really
scared.
seminal in creating YGG, so like, you guys are part of the empire.
Yeah, but wow, that's a really really interesting frame. Just sort of thinking about the player base, kind of going out and finding these play to earn games that make sense, and kind of have being the empowering these players to kind of step up and like say like, well, I want to lead the sub DAO for this game in particular. I think this is interesting investment because X Y Z. They can kind of bring it up the hierarchy, so to speak, and they can spend
Totally
time
agree.
doing the research, and if it's a good investment, if it's a good investment of time and YGG resources, then they go ahead and do it, right? I think
Well, and I
like,
think I
yeah,
think the shocker is this, right? Which is that gamers are obsessively gamers, right? And so for example, like if you go into a new fantasy role playing game, right? And you're kind of equipping your army, the YGG army, right? Like you can say, well, should we be getting like flaming sword or should we be getting blue crystal sword or should we be getting iron sword? Like what should we get for this army, right? So like the player base will tell you what to get, even if they don't think of themselves as like, oh, I'm an analyst, like I understand economics, like I got my degree from like a fancy from Wharton, it's like no, like they're like get the blue crystal sword, like the bang for buck is the best, right? Like they're like the flaming sword's too expensive, the iron sword doesn't do enough damage, get the blue crystal sword, right? So like the player's gonna know, right? So like this is an asset that ties to future cash flows. Like this is that's all analytics, right? So like I think that's the kind of, and obviously like with a really sophisticated game, like if you look at like World of Warcraft auction house, like there's just insane examples of like different kinds of arbitrage loops and things to buy and things not to buy and timings to buy, and so it gets really sophisticated, and like people are good at playing that, like just normie people, I think.
normie game devs, yeah, they don't need they don't need an expert background in economics or anything to, kind of dominate the WoW auction house. Yeah,
Yeah, I think
definitely. Or
I
RuneScape.
think Vitalik once said on a he was on a we were on a boat, and he said everything I ever needed to know about pump and dump I learned selling netherweave on the auction house, right? So like, the economics are there, right? Like it's all there for the players.
The Netherweave is a tough market, man. Yeah,
Yes.
it's a bit too much. There's too many sources for Netherweave, but yeah, no, definitely.
But it's but
Wow.
it's but it's pump and dumpable, right? Like you can definitely kind of like get a gang together and like just totally
Yeah.
ruin that market.
OPEC vibes, yeah.
Yes, cartel.
Yeah. Netherweave Cartel is like a great guild name. I'm gonna take that up one up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a dark day when YGG starts doing that, right? When they start like, pumping and dumping, in-game items on auction houses like that, hopefully they'll keep just adding value and bringing users, instead of playing tricks.
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, I think you can kind of encourage them the right path. Feel like, well, there's these other, teams that might be working on this. Let's see if YG can kind of break up that monopoly, so to speak. Yeah,
I
I
like
think.
I like Netherweave Cartel now though. That we have to make that. That's that's a thing.
Yeah, like the little icon is like the DAO icon, and it's like, well, Netherweave is 17 gold now. WYD. Okay.
I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's exciting. So I guess so sustainability is super essential, right? But to me, like what I would love to kind of have is like, you've been working on really exciting projects. Like I'd love to kind of get your view on like mechanisms. Like, have you what are the kind of up and coming hot mechanisms? Like how do you see kind of the state of the art economic design?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and I think on mechanism side of things, like one kind of really interesting mechanism to dive into is like value accrual, right? So how does value accrue to, uh, supporters of the token and supporters of NFTs as well, right? So how do kind of NFTs which are used in the game accrue value, both time value and sort of financial value, so to speak, right? So economic value within the game system, right? And I think with, for example, crypto raiders, like there's an excellent kind of like flywheel tokenomics there, right? And I can kind of break that down and how that works, right? So with with there's two kind of currencies in the game, and there's an NFT, right? The NFT is the raider, right? The raider character, and I can la- go down the layers into like the other NFTs that also been released, like such as the mobs, such as the mounts. But let's keep it sort of like the you know base layer for now. So I think
Yep.
there's really, really sort of interesting mechanism, experimentation going on with the Raiders, and I think that's kind of enabled by their, HTML5 games development, the choice to build on Phaser, and their really like sort of quick iteration cycle, right? So with Crypto Raiders, the core gameplay loop is very similar to something like Diablo, right? Where you kind of have a character, you send them into dungeons, and you kind of fight in a dungeon, and then you get loot, you get levels, and that
Yep.
makes you stronger for the next dungeons, right? There's a PvP kind of elder game as well, which is where the play to earn actually is turned on. So the play to earn happens in the PvP, where you kind of earn if you're the top of the tournament, and that kind of already creates an incentive. But it's a very sort of obfuscated incentive, right? It's not like, well, show up and you get, earn. It's show up, put in the work, like study the game, the meta game, develop a character, and then you get to sort of engage in the earning, right? So I think that's kind of the very sustainable way to kind of approach play to earn as well, and something we're seeing in crypto traders. So the most interesting kind of value accrual mechanism there, I think, is like how value accrues to Raider, right? So when there's a fixed supply of Raider, which is kind of the governance token here, and there's 100 million of these tokens that have been released, right? And when you stake this Raider, you get exposure to in-game spend, right?
Yeah.
Because whenever Aurum is spent in-game, Aurum is kind of like your in-game currency. Whenever it's spent in-game, a percentage actually flows back to Raider stakers, and the other 50% goes to the treasury for reuse in the economy. And so what we see is like the game economist on that team will actually spend time, for example, trying to balance the price of Aurum through like open market operations to ensure that the game, remains affordable for the players, right? And entry prices remain affordable for players. And then you get to make kind of economic policy decisions around when new raiders are being emitted, new characters are being emitted, right, into the
Yeah,
game.
yeah, that's
That's called
central
recruitment.
banking.
Yes, basically, basically, yeah. And I think like the interesting thing is that like you kind of have this Keynesian approach, this kind of like MMT approach towards like developing, a game and a game economy, and it's flourishing in a sense because what you want is kind of like the velocity of items and characters, and without kind of knowledge and information of like the game system, then you won't be able to kind of design a system that is able to achieve your objective, right? So I think that's what's really interesting about crypto readers so far. It's kind of scaled very, very well. I think because of being very careful about like when Aurum enters into the economy, and then like the central banking, right, having the discretion to release Aurum and such. So
Yeah.
yeah, the value accruals I think is fantastic, right, for readers takers, right? And there's a lot of game projects out there which I will not be able to say that for, even though they have kind of an excellent game, like the value accrual on the token or the NFTs have sort of leave much to be desired, right? So that's kind of one way to, yeah,
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
one
yeah.
mechanism I'm excited about.
I think I really appreciate what you're drawing attention to, right? Because my hyper primitive model of core loop, right? So when I think about core loop, I really think about four needles, right? And the four needles are actually really, really simple, right? Which is uh, inflation, deflation, right? So that's actually I consider that to be two different. I mean, it's really one needle, right? So there's really only two needles then, right? Inflation, deflation is really central banking, right? And that's basically like what's the game buying and selling, right? So is the game buying net buying or is the game net selling? Those are the two options, right? So and this applies to NFTs too, right? So in the sense of like it has to do with minting, right? So if you're so I think people describe this in game economies as like mudflation, right? Where you kind of buy the expansion pack, right? Your legendary orange gun is now like less good than the stupid wood bow that you got in the green zone, so you're sort of like, wow, like that's so bad, right? Like it's just this trash inflation, right? So like that feels very abusive, right? But at the end of the day, to me, like it's basically what's the game doing? Buy, sell, pressure, right? That's called inflation, deflation, right? Central bank. And then the other one is what is everybody else doing, right? So that's basically the other buy, sell, pressure. And obviously there may be, complicated games have like really complicated roles. So there's many different roles. There's like crafters minting new items, and so then it becomes kind of really hard to kind of conceive. But like, from a modeling perspective, it's really buy, sell, inflate, deflate, the end, right? So so I think if you start with a viable core loop and you add more mechanics with patch and potentially roll back, if you see an exploit, you should like, if your needles are moving the opposite direction than you expected, then you're like, this patch isn't working. Like, get it out. And if you have some kind of custodial centralization in your coin, you can even kind of like, the goal isn't to have to roll back the chain, right? The goal is to just roll back the function so that if someone starts kind of like printing money, like you can kind of just stop. You can say, okay, like you can keep the money you printed while this patch was going, but we stopped the patch, right? So the game rules don't support you doing that anymore, So, but I feel like if you kind of support a paradigm like that, then like to me, all that happens with central banking is that the bank looks at the token and says, "Wow, it's cheap," and buys it, right? Or the token says, "Whoa, the token's too expensive," and starts selling it, right? So if the bank is doing that, it's always buying low and selling high, right? So if it does that forever, it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger forever, right? So like that's kind of the dream.
Yes, precisely. Actually, precisely. Yeah, you kind of give away all the trade secrets right there, but yeah. Yeah, that's the alpha. That's the alpha, sir.
That's good.
But
That's
yeah,
good.
no,
I
I
dropped.
think that was kind of excellent breakdown of like how these kind of games can be sustainable, right? And I think what that now kind of reduces to the challenge that reduces to is because there's kind of interesting tension because now you kind of have to trust the game developers to sort of deliver the best experience. You kind of got to think about like their incentives and their incentive alignment, right? The token, right? So they own like some percentage in the token, right?
I
And
think
because they own the token, then that value only unlocks. So you don't have to trust that they get the, how do you say? You don't have to have the trust assumption that every single thing has to be kind of trustless, right? But you could have the trust assumption that like, well, they wouldn't want to shoot themselves in the foot by optimizing for short term over long term, right? And then all the intangibles around like, well, I'm making a good project, with a transparent roadmap, so on, so on, so on. Yeah. So I think like it actually reduces the problem of trust in their custodianship and their ability to execute, right? In some of these like play to earn games that have more sophisticated economies. It's like now um how do you now like decide whether a game is one you want to support? Well, it's just whether you trust the developers, to continue to execute on this monetary policy, to continue to execute on, keeping the game balanced and fair, both on the economy side and on the sort of gameplay side of things, right? And yeah, then from there you just roll on and,
I
print your
think I
tokens.
think I think at some level you're describing life. Like you're just describing what I call life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What you're describing though, right, is that people go into a game, right? A game is just a rule-based environment, right? So they go into that environment expected to be treated fairly, right? That's what they expect, right? Because in a way, like the thing that's so funny about being treated fairly, right, is that it's all fairly according to the rules, right? They want to be treated fairly according to the rules, right? So the thing that's so ironic to me is is 100 million users are playing League of Legends, right? And the thing that's so funny is that the rules of the game actually make the game about unfairness, right? Like League of Legends is a game that's about unfairness, right? Like you're in your lane, enemy jungler shows up, they're like 2v1ing you, they're kind of diving into the tower, right? And your jungler doesn't come, right? Your jungler's like, sorry, dude, don't want to feed, So like the game is just painfully, it's about unfairness, right? Like so in a way, like it's so funny because people still love hate that game. Like they love hate it, right? Because in a way, like they expect to be treated fairly, and in a sense, all you're saying is you're saying, if people feel unfairly treated by a system, that's when they leave, right? So in essence, like it's so interesting, right? Because obviously there's some weird moment where people can be like, the jig is up, like, developers are dumping all their tokens, so there may be a toxic moment where the whole thing falls apart, right? But in a perfect world, like these systems just go forever.
Yeah, these systems go forever, and you end up having, more and more community kind of get excited about what's being worked on, and then that's when the sort of play and earn, side of things, where you kind of have transaction, secondary market transactions end up feeding, the game and the development of the game and the salaries for developers, as well as like, play to earn rewards, right? I think that's kind of like the perfect world, right? And yes, there can be a moment where like sort of trust is lost, but the trust isn't lost when, for example, like a smart contract exploit is discovered, or like, when gas fees go up, it disappears when you begin to make the rules of the game about profiting the developers in the short term over like, ensuring the fun of players in the long term, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. And
yeah,
and the other point I wanted to make is that in a sense the thing that's kind of funny to me is it feels like we can't overly dial on decentralization as the utopia, right? Because one of the things that's so interesting is just look at patch day, right? You can either study patch day on Axie Infinity, right? Just talk to some managers on patch day, right? Or the day after, right? Or you can look at something like patch day in League of Legends and go read the forums, right? Like, can you imagine voting for which champs are being
yeah,
nerfed? Or can you imagine how toxic that would be? Like, especially if
yeah.
people were paying to win on governance. Like, okay, I'm gonna do like a flash loan for governance and I'm gonna vote for buffs on my champ and I'm just gonna destroy everyone. It's just like it would just get so ugly. Like, so in a
It
way,
would.
I feel like game design has to still be arbitered by someone who everybody loves. Like it has to be like there has to be this kind of wise, benevolent dictator who's like, that's just distasteful. Like there has to be someone who's like, no, we're not doing that. Like just very someone who's
Yeah.
really fair
Vision
and
keeper.
really like has good taste, I think, and I think putting something like that into like, decentralized governance is just it's a recipe for disaster, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's this kind of interesting tension there because it's like Well, we agree now that game design is not a decentralizable activity, at least not yet, right? And there are spaces for that decentralization and for value to kind of flow back to players, right? And you know, Crypto Raiders has done this, for example, with music, right? So it says, well, we're not experts in music, but we believe the community can come up with music. So if the community can come up with music, every player can kind of vote on the tracks they want to see in the dungeons. And now I think Crypto Raiders has some pretty fire soundtracks, right? So they've auctioned off the music as NFTs, right? Whenever they play in a game, they get a percentage of the spend in game, right?
Wow.
Eventually, right? So that's kind of like the target that the developers have set for various aspects of the game to be decentralized. But game balance, nah, no, no.
That's
That's still in the
so
purview.
That's so good and smart though, right? Because like it's so amazing how like your entire world is kind of colored by the music, right? In League of Legends there's just that crazy background music on Summoner's Rift that like plays over and over and over and it's just kind of like, "Oh my God, like can we like change it up once?" Like it's amazing what you're saying, right? Cuz that kind of contest is such a beautiful way to support kind of a community content and kind of an evergreen IP franchise, like just to really keep things alive. Because can you imagine how excited you'd be if your like music started playing for all the players? Like it's just such a great honor. It's so beautiful and such a great creator of like economic value, right? So the player base is now contributing and building your world.
For sure. Yeah, and I think like that's kind of the magic of it, and that's kind of an early taste, right, so to speak, of the mechanisms, and it's kind of achieved because they really just released the bare bones and are continuing to build on and iterate, right? Release new dungeons, build new content, and then as well as expand kind of horizontally, like the different kind of product offerings, so to speak, instead of going back to games as products, right? But yeah, I think that all kind of like ties into this vision of like, well, this game that is being built with the community, and I think that's kind of special. Yeah. So yeah,
I think
with
that this stuff gets super complicated to sort out, right? Because in a sense, like the community, like I love this kind of nascent early beginnings with little frameworks like music and collaboration, because we totally agree that like the core updates to the game rule engine is sort of like that is not like decentralized, right? So because of that, the thing that we have to negotiate as a community is sort of like what are the functions where the community kind of participates and what aren't. I think at some point things like level designs, like for sure that's going to happen, right? Like even
yeah,
in a closed ecosystem like Nintendo Switch, there's that kind of Mario Maker game where like all these crazy people made these levels and there's some pretty fun levels in there. So like, I think level design could happen, there's definitely like cuz in a way like with level design players can become like a dungeon master, right? So like, that people could put a lot into that if they really wanted to.
yeah, for sure, for sure. And they could become a dungeon master. They could add utility to any of the NFTs in the game. And I think one thing I've been kind of experimenting with or thinking about is like, well, with the mobs NFTs, right? Is there a way to kind of create like a game that centers around sort of possessing and creating new NFTs from these mob NFTs? So you have these mobs NFTs, right? And then now you want to sort of add value to that game and then to get upside within that, right? You can build like a marketplace for them, and then now you're sort of like tapping upon the player base of crypto raiders. At the same time, you're kind of extending the gameplay, and then you kind of get rewarded for that without having to work on all of the art and so on, right? To develop the mobs and such, right? So what, and of course, like building up the community, you just kind of build for their preference, and now you get a sort of percentage, through the marketplace that you build that supersedes OpenSea. Sorry. Yeah, and then one would be one would be like another would be like working together with the devs to kind of say like, well, this is an initiative that we're planning to build. Can we get some of the governance tokens for building this before we go ahead, right?
Yeah.
Or like commitment for that. And then you have like more alignment for onboarding, separate kind of divisions as owners, right? So this kind of like goes back to the principal agent problem, right? Like this idea that like, well, the person who owns the asset isn't the one who's operating the asset. And now it's like, well, you have this complete alignment on the side of the sort of UGC developers, right? And I think, if you look at
You're talking about principal agent.
yes, principal agent,
I thought you were
yeah.
saying principal Asians. I was like, oh, the Asians run things now.
Yeah, we're pretty principled, yeah, but no, principal agent. Yeah.
That's pretty awesome. So like, the thing that I'm kind of pointing at into the future is this kind of like player or gamer centric transmedia, right? So when you talk about contributions of music, or we talk about contributions of level design, or in a way you're talking about these aligned divisions, right? So in a sense the thing that becomes amazing is like if there's a DAO that forks off a animated series, or if they fork off a movie studio, or if they fork, because like if they're incentivized by the token, they're gonna make a shrine. They're gonna, when I talk about gamer centrism, like that's what it has to be, right? Like it has to be this very deeply devotional commitment to this universe, right? And in a way, like, you
Yes.
know, and if they abuse the universe, like, it's so toxic to everyone, right? So like, so in a way, like
Yes.
that's that's the genius of how this kind of infusion and this novel mechanism can be. Perhaps what can happen is you can launch a movie studio and kind of separately capitalize it, right? So that people who want to see the movie can pay like $12, and maybe they'll just, who knows what'll happen, right? Ideally they'll have put together the right team, and it won't be this kind of abuse. But I think
Yeah.
that's the kind of dream, right? The dream is gamer centric transmedia, and I think this idea that people can build and create and contribute, I think in many different ways, I think that's going to be sustainable.
Yeah, like definitely. I love that you kind of bring a lot of these metaphors into the picture. I remember like you mentioned proof of devotion, right? That was really interesting. Like in our last conversation, you mentioned like gamer devotion, like shrines. There's a lot of like these metaphors, and I think that kind of points to like the sort of totalizing effect, that game worlds can have on us, right? Like this ability for us
Yeah,
to like for it to suck us into its norms, into its like economy, into its understanding. And till today, I can still tell you like a siege tank has 150 mineral cost, 100 gas, right? And it does 70 damage, in
I
siege
love it.
mode, right? It's like
Yes,
because you sort
yes,
of internalize all of these systems, and you're like, well, 4 arcane blasts, 1 arcane missiles. That's my rotation, right? Like
I love it.
that's the kind of stuff that you become sort of attuned to as a gamer, right? And I think like rewarding, almost like providing gamers upside for like being devoted to the game and spending all of the time in the game. It's no longer that kind of weird like, well, I'm playing games, which means I'm away from like what is progression in my real life. It's like, well, games are my real life, right? And I feel like that right now in my
Yeah,
job. Games are my real
yeah,
life.
yeah, yeah. And the thing that's been so genius too is I was talking with someone about sort of the birth of the Axie Scholarship, and one of the things that's so funny about it, right, is if you think about the word, it's so cool, right? Because if you're like, hey mom and dad, I'm on the internet and I'm making money playing games, right? They're like, you're a gambler, like you're no good, you're rotten, right? And it's like, I just got a scholarship, right? And then your parents are like, oh, that's so good, like I'm so happy, like yeah, my son is the best. A student got a scholarship. So
That's so funny. Yeah, that's so true. That's a
that's
great
it.
word choice actually.
Those are
Yeah.
the those are
Wow.
those are the those are the Asian principles.
Those are the ancient principles. Yeah. The Confucian scholar, so to speak. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's super funny. But like, it's to me like what we're describing is absolutely like, like this is really the heart of the matter. So, one of the things I'm very super hoping is that, I'm hoping that, enough, my audience isn't vast, but like there are definitely some good, really good thinkers that kind of watch the show. So I'd love to kind of have this be sort of a stake in the ground around sort of making play and earn sustainable introduction of like AAA, introduction of these amazing alpha dropping kind of economic principles, and I think finally sort of a bright vision for a gamer-centric future, right? Because, if you go back to Ready Player One, right, the artists win, the business loses, right? And the beating heart of the kind of adventure game is the Atari 2600 with the micro dot where the guy is like, so it's gamer culture and gamer history, right? It's super gamer centered, and like that's how we win the metaverse. So like, I think that's the way we should look at this thing.
That's amazing. Yeah. To be able to sort of tap into the hearts and minds of gamers and sort of respect them and include them in your magic circle. Yeah, no, 100%. Like, that
No,
was a
because I
beautiful
mean,
outro. So,
to me, we've used these words like incentives, and we use this word like business versus art. But when it really comes down to it, when we talk about art, we're actually talking about love, right? Like that's what I mean when proof of devotion. I'm talking about shrines. Like I'm talking about kind of this feeling of like this is so awesome, right? Like that awesomeness, right? Because when you look at something like Arcane, ideally League of Legends players are like, this is awesome, right? And their main just shows up on the screen and walks by or whatever, and they're like, oh my god, like they just get
Jinx,
excited,
man.
right? And then when they see something like World of Warcraft movie, they just feel like pissed on from a great height. Like they just feel like this is just such a, it's just bad, right? They're
Yeah, it's
just
a big
really
letdown.
upset. Yeah, they're just upset by being abused, right? So like to me, like
Yeah.
that's the dream, right? Is to build this world where people are properly aligned, and these IP franchises just get richer and deeper and more devoted. So I think that's where we're headed. So I just want to.
Yeah.
That's a very positive note. So I think it's a good note to close.
A gamer-centric future. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. Really enjoyed it, and really appreciate you joining the show.
Thank you, Miko, for having me.